There's so many angles we could take with questions, and a couple of us, there's been questions in the chat, and also a couple of us behind the scenes have been preparing stuff. I've got to start somewhere, so I'll start with one. I think a question for all three of the speakers. Before lunch, Paralina was talking about those sorts of overlapping communities and individuals maintaining Buddhist temples in Japan. What's the role of the crowd in maintaining information on the web, as you see it at your three organizations? And how does that square with the need for experts, or for the digital equivalents of the high priests before lunch? I don't know who wants to take that question first.
I mean, I'm happy to sneak in quickly.
Go ahead, George.
Because I think Flickr is quite a luxurious situation in some ways, because our sort of medium is images, which are, easy to interpret subjectively and certainly describe subjectively. I think, Flickr was one of the first vanguards of this idea of folksonomy, which is, sort of socially or linguistically agreed upon keywording and stuff like that. And, as I was alluding to, there were never any standards or taxonomic requirements of any kind on Flickr whatsoever. And over time, with sheer mass, clusters and structures emerged that we could never have designed, So I guess in some ways it's sort of native to the medium of the internet that this information system on Flickr is so organic. And, the standards which emerge are social. It's not, if the four of us decided that we were going to tag something with lemon yellow, we would just go ahead and do that. And then the four of us would understand what that means, So really different than James and Andy's zones, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think I could probably answer. So for NHS UK, in many ways, we are publishers of content, but there's a really big sort of engagement effort, which I probably didn't talk a great deal about. So colleagues of mine in that same sort of team of 150 run the NHS UK social media accounts on Facebook, on Twitter, and elsewhere. There is two-way conversation that's going on there. Additionally, we are asking our users what they think all the time about stuff on surveys, in sort of, I was about to say face-to-face interviews, but mostly sort of, online these days, interviews with people. So there's a constant feedback loop that goes into it, but we still do have, I guess, those high priests, people like me and people like the content designers and our clinicians who are sort of deciding what gets published on those pages.
It's a really good question. It's a really interesting space. I think one of the things that's exciting about working for Full Fact is I get to say I'm a campaigner, and that's fun because you get to campaign for things. And I think one of there's kind of two parts to the maintenance piece. There's one about how more people are involved. One is there are many parts of good information on the web that are completely open for people to be able to get involved in. The Wikimedia initiatives being the really prime example of that, where you get this through the volume of people, through the organic processes, through the kind of informal structures and the formal structures, you create an overall sense of agreement. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. We were discussing this in the office just this week of, if somebody had pitched Wikipedia today, would anybody trust that it could happen? Would they have that trust in humanity that it could work? And my worry was they wouldn't, but we should bank the fact that it did. It's extraordinary. It's genuinely beautiful. And then from a Full Fact point of view, I think the interest is around systems. So we can use the fact checking to understand where the systems need to change. So the fact checks form evidence, and then those evidence can be used to influence things. So we love a petition in Full Fact land. So if we've got something at the moment where we're trying to get MPs to be able to correct the record, and one of the problems with that is in Parliament, you genuinely can't. There's not a process to allow you to correct the record in Parliament. If you're a minister, you can. If you're an MP, you can't. And so we're trying to campaign to ensure that that's a process that's there. So we can diagnose that through evidence, and then we can ask our supporters to then start to stand with us, act with us, and amplify that voice, because a small group of people can't change things by themselves. But when you can get people excited by the changes that are possible, and to show really that bad information isn't one unsolvable problem. There are lots of little things that you can do. There are quick wins and then there are big long-term wins, but to show that you can break it down is a really important part of showing that people can actively be involved in maintaining the goodness.
That's really, really interesting answers. Thank you very much. Liz, you've got your hand up. Let's just pull you in. Hold on a second. There you go. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so really interesting talks. And like I said before, I used to work in medical publishing. So a lot of, James's publishing process and things, it was like, oh yeah, this is a real blast from the past. So yeah, I appreciate all of the work that's gone into that. But I felt like this audience might kind of appreciate a kind of shared thread between some of these talks today. So I started off my career working for one of the first open access journal publishers. So instead of all of the sort of scientific data being sort of hidden away behind a paywall, it was flipping the sort of copyright and access so that all of the research data could be freely available to everyone, which is now sort of 20 years later become the norm for publicly funded science. But just this week we've launched, well, we haven't even announced it, but it's live, a resource of or a collection of resources to be used in spiritual gatherings. So readings, prayers, meditations, things like that, and all written by different Unitarians in the UK so far. But one of the things that I wanted to make sure was that they were all published under a Creative Commons copyright license, so that they can be reused and repurposed. And just hearing what George was saying about how we care for these online treasures, it just feels really interesting to think about, for both what I was talking about and Paula about sort of taking care of the physical infrastructure, the buildings, the temples, but then thinking about more and more, there's the spiritual infrastructure that exists in digital form. And it sort of makes me realize that, we've made this tiny step of making these resources that we've created kind of shareable, and but now I'm sort of starting to think, well, what about the archiving? How do we make sure that they are sustained? How do we make sure that they are taken care of over centuries? So really fascinating to think about these things. So thank you.
I was thinking about, when the pandemic was just beginning, or like I want to say even March or April in that year, all these world famous amazing musicians jumped onto YouTube and they would just do concerts like in their lounge rooms. And I'm just thinking that content, I saw some freaking amazing music in the first couple of months, and that seems so like really precious. And I just don't know whether there's any, Anyway, but yeah, it's not just Flickr, is it? It's all kinds of digital spaces that have very, very precious things in them now. And yeah, it's we got to start looking ahead a bit past the next quarter.
There was a question that in the chat from Richard Gall that was originally for Andy, but I think actually it probably applies to all three speakers. He said, thanks for the great talk, Andy. Curious how Full Fact measures its impact given the sheer scale of the information ecosystem. And I imagine actually like a question of how you measure impact, like in both NHS Digital as well, and how you're planning to measure the impact of the Flickr archive. I think, George, would be really interesting to hear, but maybe Andy first on Full Fact. How do you measure the impact?
Sure. I think it's a really good question for any kind of information service which is not transactional. So some things, as we all know, is kind of easy to say. how many people completed the checkout process, how many people filled in the form, whatever it is. When it's about information, it's harder to judge. And I think that's where I come back to we measure our impact on the volume of people who consume our information, but much more so on the changes that we can see. And so when we're looking at things like the online safety bill would be a good example over the last 12 months in the UK of looking to influence the inclusion of how harmful information is treated as part of the online safety bill is really where we position ourselves. So we use the fact checks as those kind of atomic units, and then we stack those up in different ways to then try and change the wider systems, be those the policies of internet companies, legislation in the UK, or publishing standards or codes of conduct or anything like that. And that the ability to influence those wider systems, those higher order things, is where we will generally be able to point to the biggest impact that we're able to have.
James or George?
Yeah, I think for NHS UK, because it's a website, we are sort of pushing people towards transactions very often, so we can measure for the people who let us measure what they're doing on the web. We can see what they're going on to do, so we can see that huge numbers of people would come to our content and then go on and book an appointment to get a vaccination. It sort of stops there. Once it enters the real world, we then can't tell if that individual, because we don't know about exactly who it was, but we can't tell whether that individual actually turned up for the vaccination, received the vaccination, or what the health outcome was. We talk a lot in sort of digital service world about trying to understand and build for that end-to-end journey. So making sure that when you're developing or sort of putting out a service, that you're really meeting people's needs from the very beginning to the very end of the service. And in healthcare especially, that is nigh on impossible. Not only is health there isn't an end-to-end journey apart from maybe cradle to grave, but so there isn't like a nice simple end-to-end journey. And because you've got this mix of sort of what's happening online then influences what's happening offline, incredibly difficult to track. But the things that we would do, like I say, we would look at those metrics. We would ask people, what do you intend to do after having read this content? They would give us some idea of their intent, and so we could measure the value that we're sort of delivering there. And then finally, I think sort of user satisfaction. Did this page give you what you wanted? Just being able to answer those questions, also asking those questions and then getting responses from people would give us an idea of the impact.
George?
Coming from like art and culture land, I sort of freaking hate the question, prove your impact. It's like saying, how did your body respond when you looked at the sunflowers or you heard Mahler or whatever? I'm just like, all four of us have totally different responses and reflections, and it's just the question of impact, I find, and not just arts and culture, but the third sector in general, I find it such a problematic thing. And it's made so difficult, isn't it? Because there's often not a commercial imperative, which is a simple way that we've trained ourselves over the last 200 or so years to find value in things. And I just think, I'm not trying to avoid the question, but
no,
because you can also sort of demonstrate digital use and all that kind of thing, like the guys were saying, and but frankly, I think that's also sort of metastasized into this bizarre like techno fetishism of attention and all that stuff, which is undesirable too. I don't know. I've been sort of dreaming about this concept of conversational scale, and have that be a very, very valuable and meaningful scale to keep an eye out for. I think the Long Now work that I've put in the chat earlier this morning, this project about organizational continuity, Xander Rose, who's the boss there, he's doing this amazing, enviable project going around the world talking to lots of old businesses. But one of the things that he's gleaned already in the project is that these you know, one of the businesses he found, I think, is like a 1,300-year-old hotel somewhere in Japan. And one of the reasons it survived so long is because it stayed small, you know, stayed within its bounds. It's very profitable. The team is tight. You know, everybody knows each other. They really know their shit, you know, and there's no need for them to be scaling up like we now fetishize in Techland as a good result, you know. And actually, I think this sort of broad and superficial connection of humans to each other on a platform, e.g. Twitter, is just really actually destructive to our social fabric. And I know I'm getting off the track of impact a little here, but maybe I'm feeling a bit angry about it today. I don't know.
That's actually perfect, because Laura had sort of posted a question around that idea of like longevity as a measure. I'll just pull you in, Laura. Maybe you can ask that maybe to the other.
I'm all about the nightmare of impact and whether or not it matters. But I think what I was thinking about from your talk, George, was that idea of institutional longevity. And I think, like that hotel example, being able to have something that holds things for the future feels really critical, particularly for these information maintenance questions. And we know that all kinds of institutions, public, private, state, for-profit, non-profit, can struggle with being around for the long term and not being subject to closure or reform in different directions and so on. I wondered, other than that hotel in Japan, for all three of you, are there any other examples of institutions that are managing to take that long view and preserve things that are useful in a thoughtful way? What inspires you? What institutions inspire you in this regard?
The BBC. They've been doing a bunch of PR just quite recently. Maybe there's an anniversary I don't know about, but it's like they've been diving into the archive. Andy, you know all about this. But it's just like, oh my God, we can see England from the 20th century because of the BBC.
100 years is
Thank you. Yes, 100 years. I should know that. But I am Australian.
There's a place I used to work, a place called the King's Fund, which is a sort of health and care think tank. One of the lesser known parts of the King's Fund was the King's Fund Library, which has, you know, one of the most niche. So it's a library of health policy, which is a pretty niche area. But you know, they maintain in this rather lovely building in central London just a wonderful archive of sort of academic papers, other sort of documents related to sort of health policy going back or beyond, before the creation of the NHS. And you know, that's a sort of really good example, I think, of a you know, a smallish organisation doing some you know, unnoticed, unloved work, but that is actually really, really useful and very important for not just for the researchers, but for all the people who benefit from the research that they do.
I think that all of those are excellent, and particularly the BBC is a genuinely public service broadcasting is just one of those concepts which potentially we just don't know how lucky we are that we have that until it's gone. It's so special. I think a couple of things that stand out in the sort of civic space, a little bit UK focused. I think the work that the people at the Parliamentary Digital Service are doing is phenomenal to try and make sure that that really kind of important but very dull kind of procedural information is held and done properly. And they really are trying to do it, I believe, in absolutely the right ways. And then also alongside and connected to that, the work of the National Archives in the UK is extraordinary. And John Sheridan, who runs a bunch of their digital stuff, is my hero. Like that, everything that person does is genuinely extraordinary. But that is someone who lives and breathes trying to make sure this stuff is absolutely done in the right way. And it's just heartening when there are people like that who are able to stay the distance on these really important things.
As we've been discussing this, I saw Monica Westin posted a question in the chat of whether there are any underrated orgs doing important work at any scale in maintaining truth and narrative on the web. I think maybe we've mentioned a few there, but are there are there any examples before we move on to other topics of organizations that you think are doing this thankless task particularly well, even at a very small scale? Or I guess another way of thinking about it maybe is whether there are ways that organizations can structure themselves to be able to do this, maybe at different scales. I mean, you've got the very large organizations like the NHS, although a smaller team within it, I guess, within NHS Digital, down to teams of 30 people, maybe down to smaller teams than that. Like, are there sort of underdogs who are fighting this fight at the moment that you know of, that you want to give a shout out to?
I mean, there's a very small and recent example, perhaps not quite what was intended, but there's an artist and researcher called Adam Harvey, who's an American, now based in Berlin. He goes by ahprojects.com, I think. And he's doing some really interesting investigative work on, I mean, his interest is in surveillance and biometrics and stuff like that. And he's been looking into the way corporates are trawling services like Flickr for photos of faces and, you know, collecting them up into these kind of free to use, but actually Creative Commons licensed photography, who's a really unintended consequence, you know. But he's done some really intense and good research on which corporates are doing what, and, you know, just how well, potentially illegal, definitely inappropriate reuse of this kind of personal ephemera. And just that kind of vibe of how easy it is for engineers to trawl personal content and, you know, batch it into these massive otherworldly data sets that do all kinds of other stuff. You know, it's anyway, I think he's an example of a sort of you know, some kind of freedom fighter who's interested in information being used appropriately. And
yeah. James or Andy, any thoughts?
Like, one that springs to mind is the Who Targets Me technology, which is just a great piece of kit that sort of tries to get underneath the hood of mostly sort of Facebook adverts to sort of understand actually the logic, the sort of the behavior, sort of what's actually being seen. If we think of all these ads, of which each ad has usually got like multiple teeny tiny variations of itself, and being able to see, especially for political advertising, what is being shown to people and who it is being shown to at a sort of broad level. I think that's a really, really important bit of civic tech that goes relatively unnoticed.
Yeah, huge plus one to that. The Who Targets Me are wonderful, wonderful people. Sam Jeffers, the guy who runs that, is phenomenal and does an awful lot with a really small team and unlock some really interesting stuff. We've been lucky enough to do some work with them recently, and it's really, really nice. I would say maybe at the other end of that, something that's been on my mind a little bit recently is the sheer scale of the Internet Archive, and the fact that how powerful and important that is, and the importance of context and caveats. We've seen a sort of a vector of misinformation where people will point to stuff through the Wayback Machine and say, look, bad thing happened, and it's been deleted from the internet because the man doesn't want you to see it. And often, nearly always, that is not the case. And so trying to work out how do you ensure that archives are used constructively alongside contemporary information so that things are not inappropriately used, and context and caveats is potentially the name of my biography, because I absolutely love talking about that, but that'll be another several hours, so I will not indulge you all with that today.
Well, on the topic of context, there's been some chat in the sidebar. I think it was maybe Michael mentioned like the interesting the difference between like an individual photo and an album, and there was a moment very early on in your presentation, George, where you were reconstructing that presentation from 2004, like from different angles and zooming and enhancing like something out of Blade Runner or something. It feels kind of magical being able to see something happening from multiple angles. I think we've probably all seen this on Twitter at protests or rallies or whatever, where you can see it coming in from all angles. But it feels from like an archiving point of view that this is something that the internet really doesn't do very well, like being able to stitch together a narrative or a story from these multiple viewpoints in context. Are there ways we could improve that or do that well? Or are there things out there at the moment that you think do that really well? And sorry, that was a question I'm just throwing this out at this point. I've got, I don't know who has any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the responsibility, you can like chuck a load of data and text and images and stuff into a central pot, but it needs curation and it needs looking after and it needs organizing for it to actually sort of be meaningful at the other end. That's not to say there isn't value in putting everything into that big pot. There absolutely is. But for somebody to get something out of it, like take your example of an event with multiple participants, all with their own viewpoints, you perhaps have to have someone like a journalist, then turn that into a story that others would want to consume and to bring forward the viewpoints of those. There are obviously, any journalist, any human who's going to do that is going to bring their own lens on it and their own biases, and there's going to be stuff that they miss out and stuff that they perhaps overhype, but feel it always needs that curation, and so valuing the curators is something we could all do more.
Any thoughts from the other speakers on that, or should we move on?
I'm already typing something in the chat so I can do a citation.
Yeah, perfect. I just saw George shared an example of somebody doing this with Twitter archives, which is really interesting. And we'll make sure, as we've said before, to gather up all these comments and links and stuff from the sidebar and send them out after.
I was just going to say that I think it's difficult to assemble stuff from these various platforms in a way that is easily consumable and archival strength. Like if, let's just take, I don't know, Liz Truss's election, how many different digital sources on the internet discussed that, photographed it, commented, whatever, reported on, etc. Like where is the edge of the networked content sources, that allow you to have some resolved picture? That's hard. It's really hard. So if you're relying on content coming from a variety of different digital platforms into one unified thematic space, archival space, that's really hard. Library of Congress has a really amazing digital preservation department, just by the way. They're working in Born digital material as well. And they write and talk a lot about it. Their LC Labs crews doing good stuff too. So I'd say in terms of the sort of cultural institutions appreciation of archiving these, important human things from the digital or internet space, the Library of Congress is doing some good stuff.
I just wanted to follow up on a tiny question that's zipped past in the chat, but when you mentioned 50 billion photos, George, is this a British billion or an American billion? Is it?
I know, I saw that too. I'm embarrassed to say I'm not 100%
sure
certain.
I mean, let's be honest, when you get to a large enough number, it doesn't really matter anymore.
I mean, I can't even grok what 50 billion means, whether there's 3 extra zeros or not. It's just unbelievably huge. I suspect it's the American billion, but I'm not sure, and I will check because I should know that.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. 50 billion is just an effing a lot.
Yeah, definitely, very large number. I think we've already run over slightly, I think, but I wanted to maybe ask a question again to all of the speakers, like, how can people today, like people who are on this call right now, how can we go away after today and contribute to a better information ecosystem online? Like, are there things we can do or things we can ask our friends and family to do or whatever? Like, it feels like one of the themes from this session has been that it's sort of up to all of us to be doing this and to be setting up the sort of standards for ourselves to follow and the conditions for this information to thrive. Are there things we can do right now to help that happen in our own lives? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I'm happy to nip in.
Go on, George.
I think it's very important to describe your own digital materials as soon after the creation as you can. Like text-based document or something that can be easily kind of snaffed for its entities or whatever, or, you know, computers can tell you what's in a photograph. But I think the power of a service like Flickr and other sort of folksonomic information thingies are that the creators of the materials are describing the materials. And that makes a really big difference once 5 years goes by, or 50 years goes by, or 1,000 years goes by, you know. Otherwise, we're left to future interpretation. So that's what I would suggest.
I would suggest, I'll probably go back to that theme of curation that I mentioned, which is actually pulling stuff from archives, making actual use of them, telling stories with them, hyperlinking to various places, whether you do that in a blog or a podcast or whatever. Slight tangent, I'm watching a TV series called Lucy Worsley Investigates at the moment, and it's the historian sort of going back and trying to tell sort of a few stories from Britain's past. And in every episode, she goes and meets a local historian. And this local historian is the person who has been doing all of that. They haven't necessarily been blogging about it, but they've been pulling all the information together, and they just add a richness to it. And it's the amateurs, it's the individuals, it's the citizens doing this sort of thing that keeps it alive.
That's such a good way of putting it, definitely. I think a couple of things. We want link to things. Like, the web should be a world of links, and the more we can link things together, the easiest it is to understand the context of which things were created. And the other, I mean, it's such a cliche, but metadata. Like, our metadata is our love letter to the future. Like, it's us describing our world for someone else to understand, and it is so important. I know it's really boring, but it makes the world a difference.
I love that. Thank you very much. I think that's sadly all we've got time for. I feel like we could sit here all evening talking about this. But thank you so much to our three speakers on this massively thorny, difficult, massive scale problem. All the best of luck to all three of you with continued endeavours in your various realms. I think it's time to hand over to Laura to wrap up for the day.